Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I want to go over two topics that I think you should know as an up-and-coming car enthusiast, or maybe somebody who's already into cars who just wants to become more mechanically inclined when it comes to it. So without further ado, let's get into what those two things are going to be. So the first topic I want to cover in this video is why oil and lubrication in your engine is so important. So before we get into why it's important, we have to get into the structure of your engine, which is metal. Your engine is made out of metal, whether it's an iron block or aluminum, which most modern day engines are aluminum. Now, oil is so important when it comes to metal is because when you take metal and you finish it out, no matter how well you finish metal, no matter how flat you try and get it, there will always be high and low points that are super microscopic that you won't be able to see them or machine them out fully. So when the metal components in your car rotate or start moving, they're going to rub each other and create friction. Now, friction is bad because not only does it wear metal down, but it also creates heat, and excessive heat in your engine causes damage, or it'll cause metal to expand and cause massive damage. Now, oil in effect helps with that friction and creates a layer of film for the metal to ride on so the metal doesn't touch themselves. Now, the first layer is called a boundary film. Now, the boundary film is when there's very little oil residue, but it's having some effect, but not enough to where it'll reduce friction to a point where it's non-damaging. And the second of that is when you turn your car on and that oil pump starts circulating oil through your engine, and that's called a mixed fluid film or a semi-fluid film. That's when the low points of those super microscopic metal edges are covered, but those high points when your engine's rotating still might catch each other. And after your car rotates for a while and gets the engine oil circulated through the engine, it becomes a full fluid film, which is when there's that space in between the metal that is completely filled by oil, so the metal actually isn't even touching anymore. It's riding alongside that oil layer. That's why it's important to have proper oil levels in your car so you're pumping the enough oil through it. Now, low oil levels can lead to, of course, damage to your engine, not enough oil getting to the places it needs to be, and it can actually damage the oil pump in your engine. When your oil pump isn't pumping at the rate that it should be, it'll damage itself and actually blow up before the engine does, which will cause many more problems other than oiling issues. Now that we know why lubrication and oiling your engine is so important, let's get into the component that helps keep the oil where it needs to be and helps reduce friction. And that's this right here. This is called a journal bearing or a plain bearing. Now, these sit in between the rotating components of your engine. This will sit in the rod, and this will also sit in the main journals in your engine, which is where your crank sits alongside. Now, this helps keep the engine oil in between the journal itself and the actual rotating component. Now, bearings themselves are known as anti-friction components, which means they help reduce friction. These technically don't reduce friction at all because they're a sitting journal. They sit in between the piece. It just helps keep the oil in place. So in that case, it might be, an anti-friction component, but the journal bearing itself doesn't do much to reduce friction. It's more put in place as a wear component. So in the case your engine doesn't get the oil that it needs, it'll wear the journal bearing out before it actually wears out the rod or the crankshaft or your engine. So you're replacing a small, inexpensive part compared to a really expensive, long downtime for your engine, which is super important when it comes to, your daily commute. Or if you have like a super important race car, you're replacing, a $25 bearing compared to a $15,000 engine. So we know why oil and lubrication is important, what a journal bearing is and what it does for your engine. Now we're going to get into oil as itself. Why do we use oil? Now, we use oil because it's thin and has low viscosity, and viscosity means resistance to flow. Now, in the industry, there's also another big lubricant, and that is grease. Now, grease is great for filling that space in between the metal moving parts, but it increases friction. And in an engine that spins at a really high RPM rate, you're going to have a lot of friction caused by the grease. And that's why we use oil over grease in this circumstance. And with oil over other thinner liquids that we use, you can add additives to it, which help reduce wear, reduce pressure along the metals, and helps keep the overall structure and integrity of your engine intact. So we now know why oil lubrication is important in your engine. We know what a journal bearing is and what it does for the engine. We also know why we use oil over other lubricants in industry or just in general commercial automotive. Now we're going to get into what is the short block of your engine. Now, the short block is the lower main, it's what you call basically the heart of your engine. This involves the crankshaft, which is this right here, the rods and pistons, which are a connected piece, and then the engine itself, which houses the piston, rod, and crankshaft. Now let's take a closer look at the crankshaft and the piston rod components. Now, the crankshaft is what keeps the reciprocating motion in the engine going. This is what transfers the power, and this is what houses the pistons and the rods. When combustion in the chamber takes place and the piston and rod act upon the crankshaft balances that force and keeps everything rotating in a full 360 circle. It keeps everything in line so the forces don't blow in a direction that it should not be blowing, and power is transferred properly. Next up is the piston and rod component. Now this actually is two separate pieces. It's connected by means of the wrist pin, this thing right here, and it goes through the rod itself. Through the other side has two little retaining clips on this side and that side, which connect the two pieces together. Now the piston has compression rings and your oil scraper ring, and then the rod itself is what holds on to the crankshaft. Now we get into the rod, which is actually forged in one piece, believe it or not. Now this end cap is broken off by ways of machine, but it's not broken off in a clean cut. This is actually broken off in a very rigid way to the point where it'll only go on one way. If I were to take this off, flip it around, it would not go on that way. Now this helps with overall structure and integrity of the rod in itself. And then of course the main component to your short block is the engine case in itself. Now this is a Subaru, so it has case halves. This is half of the actual engine. So the other half would bolt onto here and the crank would sit in the middle. Now these are what's called the main bearings or the main journals. This is what the actual crankshaft sits on and rotates through in the engine. Now we can rotate the engine around to get a better look at the bores of the engine. This is where the pistons sit, and this is where combustion takes place. Now combustion pushes the piston into the crank, and the opposing force of the crankshaft will push the piston back out, creating a reciprocating motion which helps rotate the crank and deliver power to your engine. Now that about does it for most, if not all, of the rotating parts of your short block assembly. Now we can talk about some cars have a camshaft that sits just right above the crankshaft and not in the heads, but that's technically part of the valve train, so I'm not going to get into that today. But I did mention earlier about your oil pump. Now your oil pump is what's called a gear pump, which in turn is a positive displacement pump. Now, when I talked about how your pump will keep pumping even if there is no oil for it to pump, that's what makes it positive displacement. It'll keep pumping at a volume, and if there's nothing to pump, it'll just blow itself right apart because it'll pump air through the vacuum that it creates, and those air pockets will literally dig out of the metal and then cause it to crumble under its own pressure, which is no good. And that's another reason to keep your oil level where it needs to be, so you will not have cavitation, which is what is called, in your oil pump. So I think that about does it for everything that I wanted to say in this video. Let's go over a quick recap of what we talked about today. And that's why oil and lubrication is important for your engine, why friction is bad for your engine, what the journal bearings do in your engine, why we use oil over other lubricants, what your oil pump does, and why it's important to keep your oil at a good level, and what the short block assembly of your car consists of. If you have any comments or questions about anything that I said, leave in the comment section down below. I would love to have a talk and just in general. Maybe you have more questions, kind of answer some of those questions for you. If you are new to the channel, please, subscribe, like, stay a while. I think you'd really enjoy it. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back and watching this video. Other than that, I hope everybody has a blessed day, a blessed night, or whatever time it is of your life. Thank you everybody so much, and I'll see you next time.